What they are is a series of ranges. So we have to the north, the Tumacacri Mountains, around the center, the Atascosa Mountains. I'm going to switch to the pointer here. Running parallel more or less to the border, the Pajarito Mountains, and then over at the western edge, the San Luis Mountains. I tend to refer to this area as the Atascosas, largely because the real center is the Atascosa Peak. So as I mentioned, it's a part of the Coronado National Forest, and I've decided to limit my study area to the bounds. It is a 203,799 acre area, so it's the fourth largest ecosystem management area of the Coronado. In terms of elevation, it's about 3,500 to 6,422 feet at the top of Atascosa Peak. So elevationally, it's not the highest. We don't get that progression from real desert all the way up to pine and evergreen woodland like you do in the Catalinas or Chiricahuas. But there's a great deal of diversity. And there's a few ways to define diversity. One would simply be number of species. My flora is not complete, but based on floras of adjoining areas and past collections that are on Cyanet and iNaturalist, I expect to find somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 species. Another couple of ways you could look at diversity would be plants per acre. Of the different sky islands in the Coronado, if you're looking at plants per acre, because this area is so huge, it has one of the lower diversities based on that criteria. However, if you look at it as plants per foot of elevation gained, it has the highest diversity of plants per foot of elevation gained of any of the ecosystem management areas within the Coronado. It's 1 plant per 3 feet of elevation gain. In the Pajarito Wilderness, it's actually higher. It's a 1-to-1, so really quite a high diversity there. Now, there are a number of factors that contribute to the diversity of this area. The first is that, like the whole Sky Islands region, it's located at the confluence of several different zones. You have influences from the Rocky Mountains to the north, obviously the Sonoran Desert to the west, Chihuahuan and Great Plains deserts to the east, and then the influence of the Sierra Madre coming up from the south. The Atascosa Highlands are towards the western edge. This is them right there. It's so it's very close to the western edge. And you'll notice that in terms of north-south, it's pretty close to the middle of the Sky Islands. So you get a really great influence from these different zones. A great example can be found in these 2 plants here. We have Nossia fendleri, that's a brassica there. And that plant reaches its southern limit in the Atascosas. We also have Lobelia laxiflora, pardon the somewhat blurry photo. Now that's a plant that reaches about the northern limit of its distribution in the Atascosas. Here we have the Cyanet distribution maps. This is again Nossia fendleri, goes just about to the border with Canada and really reaches just about its southern limit in the Atascosas. And Lobelia laxiflora, which actually goes way down into Central America off the map here and reaches its northern distribution. So that's a good illustration of how these different ecosystems really come together here. Another factor that contributes greatly to diversity is ruggedness of landscape. So again, despite not having the same elevation as sky islands like the Chiricahuas or Catalinas, the really, really rugged landscape that creates quite a few microclimates. This is a photo by Luke Swenson from Atascosa Lookout facing south. And to circle back to this being, part of this larger Sky Island region, I defy anybody here to tell me from this photo where the United States ends and Mexico begins. So, borders really have no relevance when we're talking about some of these Sky Islands. So the ruggedness is immense. This area is cut through with a number of canyons that again create great microclimates for an abundance of different plant species. This is a map put out by Sky Island Alliance. Their nomenclature is a little different from, I think, what most of us are typically using when we talk about areas. So what they're calling Apachean shrubland is what I think most of us probably refer to as desert grassland, semi-desert grassland, grassland, scrub grassland. You can take your pick. That is to say, it's an area dominated by a diversity of grass species. That being said, these areas do host a number of shrubs, and increasingly so. Grazing and other disturbances have contributed to a great increase in plants like mesquite and various mimosas that have come to have a lot of prominence in these grasslands. Now, there's also quite a bit of what they're calling Madrean encinal. That's oak woodland, and that area is really prominent. There's quite a few different oak species in the highlands. And then there's just a little bit of oak pine woodland. So the top of Atascosa Peak, you get a little bit in Sycamore Canyon, which is lower elevation, but a cooler microclimate. They don't list it here in Bartolo Mountain, but there's quite a nice stand of pines on Bartolo. So that's, basically the habitat types. Now, if we're looking at diversity of species, a number of studies have shown that the greatest diversity of species within Sky Islands tends to be within those semi-desert grassland and oak woodland habitats. So the prominence of those two habitats in the range definitely contributes to the diversity. Now, I'll back up to say we're going to focus on a few different areas. To start off with, we'll focus on the Tumacacori Peak area. So that's in the northeast corner of the range. We'll also have Kumero Mountain, which is a very under-collected area on the southwest side of the range. And of course, Sycamore Canyon, which is probably the best known area within the Atascosas, the most commonly collected. There is a great flora from 1979 of Sycamore Canyon. So that was the one complete flora from the area. Now, we'll also say that sampling effort will likely show a number of new species. Just in my, I'm just a plant enthusiast, but I found a number of new species not previously collected in this area in the course of my study. And I would really encourage anybody who's interested in Sky Island botany to pick an area, maybe not quite so big of an area. You can focus on one mountain, one trail, one canyon, and really spend time there. And sampling effort will undoubtedly reveal new species. All right, so starting at the Rock Corral Canyon, this is Tumacacori Mission. It's on the east side of I-19. This photo is looking west past the mission towards Tumacacori Peak, which is again towards the northeast corner of the range. Between the, kind of around the mission is the Santa Cruz River. This area has drawn inhabitants for thousands and thousands of years who also went into the Atascosa Tumacacori Highlands. Now, there's a couple of interpretations of the name Tumacacori. One is land of flat rocks, which would be an accurate name. The other, and probably more popular, is place where wild chilies are harvested. This would also be accurate. If you watched our first Tucson talk of the season, we had Perrin McNellis talking about wild crop relatives in the Tumacacori Highlands, and she focused a little bit on chiltepines. This is the view as you move into Rock Corral Canyon. Tumacacori Peak is out of screen here, off here. This peak here has actually trincheras or hohocum walls on the top. There's also a tank, a tinaja up there for holding water. So that's, again, good evidence of long-term habitation of this area. And this view is actually from the top of Rock Corral Canyon, where it terminates in a wall of hills. You can see Tumacacori Peak and the Santa Rita's here. Now, there's a number of really cool plant species that can be found in Rock Corral Canyon. I'll focus on just a couple tonight. One would be this plant, Eisenhardia orthocarpa, or Sonoran kidneywood. So this is a legume, which is one of the really big families, the big three in the Southwest in general, but in the Atascosa Highlands. The flowers have a nice vanilla-like fragrance that are attractive to a number of insects. Here we have a Lycus beetle, which is a nectar-feeding beetle that I have frequently observed on these plants. The specific epithet orthocarpa, think tooth seed refers to the seeds, which look very much like little teeth. It's not a big bean pod like mesquite. It's a very small seed. They're typically anywhere from a small shrub up to a reasonably good sized tree. You can actually get a pretty good indication of what sort of microclimate you're entering based on the size of Eisenhardtia in the vicinity. If they're really small and scrubby, it's going to typically indicate an area that freezes. Mid-size is kind of in the middle, and occasionally you'll run into really nice, beautiful specimens that would tend to indicate that you're in a warmer microclimate. So this is a plant that you can find growing kind of throughout the Sky Islands region. It kind of terminates right at the southern edge of the Catalinas, Rincons. It runs much further south than this map shows, but you can see there's great populations throughout the borderland Sky Islands of southern Arizona. It's also a relatively commonly available plant in the nursery trade, and one that can certainly be grown in the Tucson area. So recommend it if you're at the local nurseries. It's a good patio tree. Another plant to focus on is Amaruxia palmatifida, Saya. This is a really beautiful little plant that has kind of a carrot-like tuber. You really only see it during the monsoon season, so July, August into September, depending on rains. It has an extremely showy flower that's pretty hard to miss. The petals can range from kind of orange to more of a yellow. They're really identifiable because of these sort of burgundy anthers there. The fruit is kind of a balloon, sort of a balloon shape. This is one that will be low to the ground, typically dotting hillsides in the semi-desert grassland. So it's definitely one, if you're down willing to brave the hot season down there during the monsoons, it's worth your while to take a look for this plant. Now we can see the seed pod here, again, kind of balloon shape. And then this is actually another Amaruxia gonzalezii, I believe. It's typically identifiable by the lighter anthers. They're not that burgundy color. They're more cream. And that's a state-listed rare plant that's pretty uncommon, but is found in a number of populations in southern Arizona. It sort of seems to be mixed in amongst the other species of Amaruxia, but it's worth keeping an eye out for. I will note that these are highly edible plants. Please do not ever pick the gonzalezii due to its rarity. And palmatifida is fairly available in native plant nurseries like Spadefoot or Desert Survivors. So it's worthwhile to grow that as a seasonal edible. You can eat the flowers, seed pod, foliage, and tuber if you have enough of them. And here's the distro map for that. It does go a little bit further south than we can see here. But again, this is a plant that more or less terminates in the Sky Islands of southern Arizona. Just such a fantastic habitat. Another one I'd like to focus on from Rock Corral Canyon is Haplophyton. So this is a Haplophyton semicidum variety Cruxii. A lot of older texts will just list it as Haplophyton Cruxii. A real diminutive plant. Again, you'll probably only notice it during the monsoon season when it's in bloom. It's in the Aposinaceae, so that's the milkweed family. And if you look, you can see it has flowers that are very reminiscent of Plumeria, to which it is also related. This one's typically mixed in with shrubs, subshrubs, and grasses. These were found, if you go into Rock Corral Canyon, you'll look up at the peaks and notice these sheer rock faces. This is found at the base of those sheer rock faces. So you do have to do a bit of climbing. One thing I have learned is it's worth investing in a pair of gaiters because there are a lot of seeds that will stick to your socks as you go tromping through the grassland, and really ruins them pretty quick. Here we can see the seed pods there. So it's these paired follicles. They will dry and split, revealing the seeds here. Now, if you're familiar with milkweed seeds, you know they'll have the seed and then this pappus of hair here. This is cool because it's got the double papi, I guess you'd say, which I have not seen in milkweeds or other members of the Aposinaceae. So that's a pretty unique little seed. You have to be there at just the right time to get it. These seeds are from Desert Survivors, where we bag the seed pods to make sure that we can collect them. Otherwise, they'll blow away because of those hairs. And here again is a distribution map. So we can see this is variety Cruxii, which is very much a Southern Arizona, Northern Sonora species. There is the wider Haplophyton semicidum, which also grows out into Texas. Now, the next locality I'd like to focus on is Kumero Mountain. Again, this is at the extreme southwestern end of the range. Looking at this photo, basically what's on the, in this case, left side of the road is the Coronado National Forest. On the other side, you're mostly looking at Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge. And if you look closely, you'll see this line in the distance. That is border wall construction. So this is very close, about 2 miles north of the border. Again, this is a really under-collected area, which is quite interesting, and I've been really grateful to spend time there. One of the cool species you'll find is the Rio Grande butterfly bush, Budlia Siciliflora. So this is a shrub that's really only found near perennial seeps. This plant here in a photograph taken by Luke Swinson. That's why the lighting is so much better than my photographs. There's just like a little well under here. And this is in a population of just about 6 or 7 plants. There's very few populations of this plant left in Southern Arizona. I think we can largely attribute that to groundwater pumping and degradation of spring habitats. I've found 3 populations in the Atascosa Highlands, one in Rock Corral Canyon, one here in Kumero Mountain, and another in around Peña Blanca Lake. So you're looking for areas that have pretty much year-round water. Populations are quite small. In Kumero Mountain, the population is, I believe, 6 or 7 plants. They don't seem to be reproducing readily, and they do seem to be pretty genetically bottlenecked. So this is a plant that is, I believe, largely disappearing from Southern Arizona. It may continue to hang on in a few refugia, but it is more common as you get into Sonora. Here are a close-up of the blooms. Now, plants in the wild that I've seen never look this good. This is a plant in cultivation at Desert Survivors that gets quite a bit of overflow water from a nearby hoop house. The flowers have a really interesting fragrance, kind of like red hots and gym socks, which I know doesn't sound particularly attractive. I guess the other association I've had is roasting cacao, kind of a bitter but somewhat sweet aroma. You get bees, butterflies, and pollinating flies, which, a lot of times when we're thinking about bringing pollinators into our landscapes, we want to ignore these pollinating flies, but they're actually really fascinating and helpful and beneficial pollinators. So this is another plant that's rare in cultivation, but I would really recommend anybody that has extensive gray water works or maybe an outdoor shower could consider growing this plant because it will really benefit from the additional water. And, especially trying to get accessions from different populations and hopefully cross them to introduce some genetic diversity into this otherwise bottlenecked species. Here again is the distribution map. Again, very few populations in Southern Arizona, much more common in Sonora. I assume maybe I haven't spent much time botanizing Sonora, but perhaps their spring quality is a little bit better down there, less development, perhaps less groundwater pumping, but maybe there's somebody here who could speak to that in the question and answer period. Another really, really cool plant that's in this canyon in Kumero Mountain is sweet acacia, Vicelia farnesiana. Used to be an acacia, but as many of you know, I'm sure we lost all of our acacias to the Aussies. So now we have 4 genera to replace them and make things confusing. This plant is not really considered native in Arizona. It's found extensively in Sonora, down into Central America, Texas, Florida. Most of the places I've seen it in Arizona are like roadsides, but there's a really good population in this canyon. It's the only place I've found more than a single plant in my study area. How they got there is an interesting question. But yeah, again, this is a photo by Luke Swinson, and you can really see the how they stand out. This is, I think, November, last week of November, perhaps. You can see how everything else is drying up, dropping leaves, but they really stand out with that nice green color. Here are a couple of more close-up photos. Now, if you're in Tucson or Phoenix, you've probably seen these grown as massive shade trees. The plants that I've seen here in Kumero Mountain, there's about 30, and they are pretty darn bushy. They look like a giant velvet pod mimosa, more or less. And as you get closer, you'll notice, though, that they're quite different with the paired straight thorns and the indicative foliage there. Here's another couple of shots just showing that plant. Now, these aren't the most exciting photos. They don't show the flowers or anything, but I'm very, very excited about this plant being here. It raises a lot of interesting questions. Again, if this plant is not really considered native to the United States, what is such a healthy stand doing in this area? Now, again, you look at a distro map and there's, it seems fairly widespread. You can see it makes its way down to Central America, Florida, Texas, but almost all of these accessions here are from urban areas or along roadsides. If we look, actually at wild areas in southern Arizona, these are the accessions. It's the Babaquiviri Mountains, and I believe the last time it was collected there was the 80s. Most of these collections are from the 30s, 40s. And then there's two collections from Kumero Mountain, one by myself and one by Jim Verrier. Many of you will know him from his excellent Flora of the Catalinas. And he was the one that turned me on to this spot. So, we can ask how this plant got here. I think there's a few possible explanations. One might be that it is native and just is here. Another might be cattle grazing. Obviously, this whole area has been heavily grazed, something I'll talk more about later. Now, acacia beans are not as attractive to cattle as something like mesquite beans, but desperate times may call for desperate measures. I wouldn't be surprised if they would eat them in a pinch. And though this canyon is pretty rough country, it's certainly possible cattle could get in there. You'd be amazed at the places cattle will go. Another possibility could actually be humans. Again, this area has had human occupation for thousands of years, and there's extensive evidence of human occupation in the Kumero Mountain area. Right at the top of Kumero Mountain is this incredible, incredible boulder covered in a number of Hohokam pieces of art. So the Hohokam would have been in this area from approximately 600 to 1450 AD. They were clearly, based on what we'll see in the next photo, at Kumero Mountain for a while, coming a number of times and visiting. This rock's extensively covered in art. There are a few other rocks in the vicinity that also have a number of beautiful, beautiful illustrations on them that are pretty indicative of Hohokam art. I think the interesting thing about this is that most Hohokam sites are associated with rivers or more or less perennial water, which would indicate to me that Kumero clearly had springs. We had the Budlia Siciliflora there, but it may have had much more extensive springs at one time that would allow people to hang out for long enough to be making beautiful, beautiful art like this. Here's another piece of evidence that would suggest that people were visiting this area for a long time. This is a bedrock mortar. So would have ground, say, mesquite beans in this mortar here. And based on how well worn it is, that would indicate to me that people were there for a while. It wasn't just, a single stopover. So Kumero Mountain's a really fascinating, highly under-collected area. It's really easy to get through the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge. And right where this bedrock mortar is, there's a nice little turn-off campsite. So I'd really highly recommend folks make their way there and check out some of the cool plants growing in that site. Now, I'll also talk about the most popular destination in the Atascosa Highlands, which is Sycamore Canyon. So Sycamore Canyon has an extremely high diversity of species. I mentioned earlier the, plants per foot of elevation gain criteria of looking at diversity. Sycamore Canyon has about a 1-to-1. So that is to say, for every foot of elevation gain, there's a species, which is a off the charts diversity. The canyon has extremely steep walls that create a number of microclimates. So you do find species here that are not common elsewhere within the range or within southern Arizona. Now this is an interesting case. These are yuccas, and as anybody who botanizes this area knows, there's sort of the Yucca Elatas, which are more down in the grasslands. There's the Yucca baccata, variety brevifolia or Yucca arizonica, which is a common yucca. And then there's a lot of controversy around Yucca Madrensis or Madrensis, has some unsettled nomenclature. These are interesting because they show intermediate characteristics between, to me, Yucca elata and Yucca Madrensis. Now, if you've ever looked at the work of Wendy Hodgson, she's done some work on these very ambiguous yuccas that are found around Arizona. But this, to me, appears to be some sort of hybrid. So I'm not sure quite what to call it. For now, I call it, Yucca tentatively Madrensis, but it has these extremely floppy leaves, very thin. It almost resembles, when it doesn't have a trunk, beargrass, Anolina. So really an interesting thing to find. Here we can see again these extremely flaccid leaves, and then sometimes a little bit more upright. But this is definitely an interesting yucca. Really, you only find it in this Sycamore Canyon area. So it's one to take a look at, and hopefully someone settles the genetics on these yuccas and gives us some closure on the nomenclature. Now, another plant that you can actually see in the background here is Choisya. So currently, the preferred nomenclature for this plant is Choisya dumosa variety mollis, but you will see it listed as Choisya mollis in older texts. There is another Choisya in the southern Arizona Skylands, dumosa variety arizonica, but that has very different qualities. This mollis is really only recorded from the Atascosa Highlands. It seems to be a very local geographic variant, and it stands out from the other Choisyas by its very sort of furry hirsute leaves or hairy leaves. This is a really cool, this is a pollinator. I'm not sure if this is a bee or a pollinating fly. Note that it's not visiting the, it doesn't appear to be going for nectar on the plants. It appears to be going for oils. I saw it visit the leaves and the petals of the flower. These plants are a member of the Rutaceae or citrus family and are extremely fragrant and produce both, floral and vegetative oils that I assume might attract an insect like this. These are the plants in bloom. It's a really, really lovely flower, late summer and early fall. I have been working on this flora for a little over 3 years now, and had wanted to see these plants in bloom for a long time. And one of the, lights during the dark year of 2020 was finally catching these plants in full spectacular bloom. They're growing up on the sides of the canyon, shaded by oaks. They don't really, this mollis doesn't appear to be in full sun. It really does like these shady canyon edges, and it's typically growing out of rocks, so not, a deep soil. And that can make this plant tricky in cultivation. It really, really needs good drainage and has quite a high rot potential in typical horticultural soils. Here's an example of this, a big patch of this plant. This is a north-facing side of the canyon. And it appears, based on the time I've spent in here, that these plants are not really reproducing by seed. I've seen quite a bit of insect boreholes in the seed pods, so there may be viability issues. Most of these are from sort of root runners or actually air layering in the oak duff there. So I believe that the majority of this population, if perhaps not, most of it, would be actually vegetative clones. So I'm not sure how much diversity there is within these populations. It may be somewhat limited due to their seeming preference for vegetative reproduction. And here again, we have distro maps. This is Choisya. The red is sort of Choisya dumosa variety arizonica. The yellow is Choisya dumosa variety mollis. And then if we look at this distro map, we can see the dumosa variety dumosa, which is more of a Chihuahuan species. Here's a little, I'm a little sore about them being lumped with dumosa because I hate to lose a good Arizona plant to the Chihuahuan desert, but that's all right. I won't worry too much about it. Now, another really, really cool plant that can be found in Sycamore Canyon and a few other localities is Tillandsia recurvata. So this is the only Tillandsia or air plant found in Arizona. It'll be on trees and rocks. You can find quite a bit of it on the ground. So it's an epiphyte, as you can see from this beautiful studio photograph by Luke Swenson on the stick here. And here are actually the seeds splitting out of the fruits there. Here are some examples of the plant in habitat. I've seen it on pines, oaks. I've also seen it on rocks, as we can see here. And again, you'll frequently find plants littering the ground. So this is a really, really cool plant that you can find in a few of the Sky Islands of southern Arizona, but it's really just fascinating to have a Tillandsia here. The only other place I've seen, extensive diversity of Tillandsias in my personal botany travels is Australia in the eucalyptus forests there, growing on wet cliff sides. So it's really cool to be able to see that here in Arizona. And here's the distro map for Arizona. Again, limited primarily to the Sky Islands along the border, but you can also find it in the rincons. So, and even a little further north, I believe these are the Pinaleños. So you'll find it in a few different ranges, or sorry, I believe these are the Galleros. Now, another really, really cool plant you'll find in Sycamore Canyon is this Graptopetalum bartramii, or Patagonia leather petal. So this is a really cool, soft, succulent species found growing on hillsides. It's been a candidate for being listed as endangered for a number of years. It is considered state listed rare and threatened. I think this plant benefits from growing in areas that cattle really couldn't get to. I'm sure that helps. But this is just a fascinating species and really hard to find in habitat. You have to really take your life into your own hands and get up on these cliff sides, move aside the bare grass or look into cracks in rocks, and you'll find that plant growing in there. This plant here is one that over the course of 2020, I've watched completely die. Now, theoretically, these plants have quite a bit of ability to dry out and rehydrate, but this plant, which is on a more exposed hillside over the course of 2020, completely dried up and is now dead. Now, you can count the number of plants in Sycamore Canyon probably on, 2 hands, 2 feet. There's not a great number of them. Part of that, again, is that they're difficult to find, so there may be more, but to lose even a single plant is really tragic. And I can't help but wonder what this long-term drought will hold for this species. And here we can see the blooms, kind of a late winter flower, or, I think this might have been fall, probably October. So really just a fantastic bloom, really unusual, and one of the few sort of soft succulents that you'll find in Arizona. I worry about these plants because collectors in California and have collected a lot of like Budlia species, and I worry that if word really gets out about these graptos, there could be potential for collection. I doubt they do very well in cultivation, so it'd be really sad to see these plants taken out of the wild, put in somebody's private collection where they would, maybe rot and die. Hopefully some horticulturalists will get permission to grow these plants out, and perhaps it could be made available in the nursery trade, which might mitigate the desire to take these plants out of the wild. And another one I want to focus on is this Lincera Albaflora. So many people are familiar with the horticultural honeysuckles, but this is one of our native honeysuckles that you can find growing in Sycamore Canyon. These beautiful flowers. It's kind of a shrubby vine growing up canyon walls or trees. Here's another couple shots of the flowers. It's just really a lovely, lovely plant. And, the only place I've seen it in the Atascosas is Sycamore Canyon, again, due to its kind of more moist, humid microclimate. And here's the distribution map. So it grows all the way up into central Arizona and then kind of reaches more or less its limit here in southern Arizona. So just a fantastic species to keep an eye out for. And finally, I believe this is my last species from Sycamore, but this is a plant, it was formerly Lotus Alomocenus. I believe now it's in the genus Hassackia. So this is another legume. This is a species that just loves water. So this is growing right on the edges of the stream that runs through Sycamore Canyon. It's very riparian habitat. It seems to spread prolifically by runners in these wet microclimates with just these gorgeous flowers. And again, this is a fairly uncommon species. And again, likes these wet habitats where you might find dragonflies like this one here. And you can see the Hasakia there in the background. And again, here's a distro map. So very limited distribution. I believe this is primarily due to its desire for really wet microclimates and habitats. This is a recent collection, I believe 2018 or 2019, and this is by far the northernmost collection of this species. So that's pretty exciting recent range extension. And again, a good example of how if you collect in areas, you may turn up species that weren't previously known. This is from a great flora of the Verde Valley by Cole Whitaker. And I lied. Maybe I have another species from Sycamore. This is a hedgehog cactus, the Santa Rita hedgehog, Echinocereus santaritensis, also listed as Echinocereus coccineus, subspecies santaritensis. This is another beautiful photo by Luke Swenson. Again, you can see that they're growing right out of sheer rock. So again, a rather rot-sensitive species, really identifiable by these beautiful small flowers and fairly thin spines. Here again, this is, it's hard to tell from this photo, but on the top of a pretty sheer canyon wall here. And you can see them reproducing under the oaks there, seeming really to thrive in that oak duff. They can form really dense clusters of, up to like 50 branches, but most often you'll see them in clusters of perhaps 3 to 15 branches. And again, these just really gorgeous identifiable flowers. And here's that distribution map. So, mostly southern Arizona, northern Sonora center. A really lovely species. Keep your eye out on these boulders that you'll find in these canyons and the Sky Islands. And there's a good chance you'll see this plant blooming late spring and into the summer. Now here's one other really exciting, I guess I really lied. I spent a lot of time on sycamore. This is Psilotum nudum, the naked whisk fern. So this plant is known from literally one population, and in fact, just one plant. This is it. This is the entire population. I have looked for it for years, never found it. And then I went out with a friend, Kai Lepley. It's his first time in Sycamore Canyon. Right away, he's like, hey, I think that's it. I was happy to find it, but I was a little annoyed at myself having walked by it literally dozens of times. This plant probably came along with a bird. Perhaps certain species of birds use it for nest building, and any ornithologists or bird enthusiasts out there will know that Sycamore Canyon is a very, very well-known spot for bird diversity. This whole year collecting in there, I never failed to hear and sometimes see an elegant trogon that had made its home there in Sycamore Canyon. So my assumption is that a bird brought this fern along, and that's why we have this really interesting disjunct population growing there in Sycamore Canyon. Worldwide, it's a pretty common species, but in southern Arizona, extremely rare. Now I'm going to move out of the 3 areas we've talked about, Rock Corral, Kumero, and Sycamore Canyon, and just showcase a few generally cool plants from around the Atascosas. This is Agave Parvaflora. Parvaflora refers to the small flowers, and it lives up to the name. It has the smallest flowers of any agave species, and it's a very diminutive plant in general. It could be confused with the much more common Agave Shadii, but generally Agave Shadii will be found growing in these really massive clonal populations. This plant, while it does clone, is typically found singly or in small numbers. The leaves are much shorter and it's a much more compact rosette of foliage. The flowers can range from kind of a greenish color up to a pinkish color. And you're typically looking for this one in grasslands. However, it doesn't seem to compete well with dense grass cover. So I most often find it in patches like this where the grass is somewhat thinner. And I've only found it in areas that have great populations of native grass, not some of the introduced species which form these really dense monocultures that I think would outcompete this plant. This is a pretty good illustration of how you're likely to find this plant. It's just usually this single stalk sticking up from the grass. And that's what you're looking for as you're driving down Ruby Road carefully, not getting into any accidents or running into anybody. That's how you'll typically find this plant. And here we can see just my pruners, Valentine's gift from my lovely wife, compared next to an agave, and gives you an idea of how small these plants are. They're just really tiny. And these couple of photos here show, again, just a little seedling. Here we can see a cluster of plants. This is singly. There's no other plants around this. And it's one that I just happened to see off of Ruby Road one day that I'm sure I've driven by, 40, 50 times before I finally saw it. Now, I haven't focused on any grasses, and I would be remiss if I did not. So this is a really, really great grass, Eleonoris barbicolmus. I'm a grass fanatic, and this is definitely one of my top 3. It's a really identifiable grass, common name woolly balsam scale. The seed heads are quite unique. It takes on a beautiful reddish color in the fall. And if you get close to the plant, you'll find that the blades are almost rounded rather than flat. And that's a really good diagnostic characteristic. It's not a rare grass necessarily, but it's also not super common. It's found, in isolated patches. Here we can see a close-up of the blade, of the inflorescence, which again, we can see these sort of scaly inflorescence there. And that's a good diagnostic characteristic. Here we can see it again with border wall construction in the background. I was, spent quite a bit of time trying to botanize these areas that are currently under construction so that we can get a baseline of what was occurring there. Because I believe a big impact of this road building and wall construction will be introduction of non-native species that may begin to outcompete some of the natives in the area. Here's another couple of photos. Again, just a beautiful, beautiful grass species. Really stands out from the more common Muhlenbergias and Budaluas. So if you're in the skylands of southern Arizona, it's well worth keeping an eye out for. Here's the distribution map. And this genus Eleonoris is really a tropical, subtropical genus of grasses. And this barbicolmus is, I believe, the northernmost species within that genus. Another great cactus is the Coryphantha recurvata, the Santa Cruz beehive cactus. So very rare cactus, though it's actually somewhat, I won't say abundant, but it is somewhat common within the Atascosa Highlands. Again, you're looking for basically sheer rock habitat. To get this photograph, I very stupidly climbed a sheer cliff, which seemed like a really great idea when I had the urge to photograph this plant, but which really sucked trying to get down. So be careful if you're looking for this plant. But it's a beautiful cactus, usually found singly or in clusters. It's identifiable because these downward recurved spines. You'll catch it most often when the sun is shining down into a canyon and these golden spines reflect the light. And it's a really densely spined plant. Because it's typically found right on these canyon edges, I don't think it's prone to being crushed or as much by cattle. So I think it's chosen a really nice niche for itself, right on these rocky edges of canyons where it's sort of out of the way of any animals that could potentially disturb it. Now we're going to move on from cool plants to some of the historical and recent threats for the Atascosa Highlands. Historically, one of the biggest impacts on the area has been mining. There are literally thousands and thousands of mine claims in the Atascosas. Now that doesn't mean they were all active, but as you drive through the highlands, you will find just abundant evidence of mining. You'll find holes in the ground, discolored piles of mine tailings, and the mother of all mines in the Atascosas was ruby. So here we have Montana Peak. Apparently it used to be much wider, but an earthquake brought down a big segment of it and gave it its identifiable shape. It was in the late 1800s, I believe. And what we're looking at here are the ruby mine tailings. It's a really bizarre and surreal experience to be standing on this. It's the texture of beach sand. It's rock that's been crushed by a mill filled with steel balls, after which chemicals were poured through it, mercury and arsenic. I'm not a mining expert, but I believe those were what were primarily used. Those form an amalgam with the metal, and then the metal can be separated. So initially, Ruby was mining for gold and silver. Later on, base metals like lead and zinc. This tailings dam fills in a canyon just east of town and is made up of approximately 700,000 tons of mine tailings. So that's rock pulled from the earth, crushed, chemicals poured through it, and deposited in a canyon. And it's just really bizarre because you're looking at these oak and mesquite studded hillsides standing on more or less a beach. Very, very little can grow. We have a Berkelia here, desert spoon here, cane beard grass, and Bermuda grass. Those are just about the only species, and they're typically growing near the edges. I wonder if being near the edges, there's some real honest goodness soil underneath there that they're able to root into. And the plants are pretty scraggly. And I imagine that during storms, this sort of beach sand erodes away, which might be why the roots are so exposed on this Berkelia. I imagine it's very, very nutrient poor, which might contribute to the sorry look of this desert spoon behind it there. The other really big impact, and one that is, continuing on into the modern day, is cattle grazing. So I mentioned earlier that the Atascosas are 203,799 acres, or that's the EMA of the Coronado. Of that, 200,406 are grazed. So the vast, vast majority of this area is grazed and has been for, extensively since the late 1800s, but, periodically since well into the late 1600s, early 1700s. This has involved the installation of a number of cattle tanks. Here we can see a cattle tank that's sort of overflowing and really illustrates the hoof impact of cattle as they move through the landscape. Here we have a cow that is in Sycamore Canyon, which is actually one of the very few areas that cattle are not supposed to be. But very often barbed wire fences fail or fall down. And so these cattle are frequently found in Sycamore Canyon, which again is supposed to be one of the only places that they are not allowed within the highlands. Of course, we can't blame the cattle as much as the ranchers that are not maybe maintaining their fence lines as well as they should be. Here's another example of the impact of cattle, and also ties into the next big point, which is climate change. We're in a couple decade-long drought. The National Weather Service is listing us as being in their highest level of drought. And so these stock ponds and cattle tanks are quickly draining. It will actually be interesting to see what happens to the cattle industry. I'm not opposed to ranchers inherently, and I've spoken to ranchers in the area, and they express a lot of concern about the viability of ranching into the future. Others think that it will be just fine, and groundwater pumping and other infrastructure improvements will help it continue, but only time will tell. Now, I'd like to circle back to an earlier point about sampling effort. So this is Glinus Radiiatus. This is the first collection of this plant from the Atascosa Highlands. And I don't think that's because it's particularly rare. It's not. It's quite common around stock ponds. It's just that most people, when botanizing, like to go to beautiful areas. They like to go to Sycamore Canyon, see rare and unusual plants. And most people don't really want to spend time botanizing old, dirty, muddy, cow poop filled stock ponds. But really botanizing roadsides, disturbed areas, old mining sites like Ruby, and old stock ponds can yield species that are unrecorded from areas and can help us get a better handle on what species occur in a given area. So I highly recommend next time you see an area that you think just looks god-awful ugly, take a closer look, because you never know what you'll turn up in those areas. Now, another big impact is border wall construction. I have my personal feelings which can be quite strong. I try and take a somewhat scientific approach when looking at it as it regards my flora. I kind of doubt, though time will tell, whether border wall construction will have as much of an impact as things like grazing. It is somewhat limited to a narrow strip. However, the level of impact in that area is immense. So we can see a great example here. Hillsides have been just flat out blasted. Obviously, I'm sure we're all aware of the larger political situation, the incoming president's promise of not one more foot of wall, but that's actually much more complicated to uphold than it sounds, because rather cynically or cleverly, depending on your perspective, the outgoing administration has awarded contracts for another 350 miles of wall. And it will cost the US taxpayer millions or perhaps billions of dollars in litigation and remediation to stop wall building where it's at. One of the effects of this sort of time crunch, this push to get as much mileage done as possible, has been that they will focus on areas that are easier. So there are a lot of hillsides that might have wall on either side, but not up the hill. There are many, many drainages which lack wall. So this thing is, when you hear figures like 450 miles of wall, the big thing is that it's not contiguous. It's in patches, which makes it all the more, perhaps this is unscientific, but ludicrous. There's also been very little effort to support the roadsides. So I think more than the impact of the wall itself, I see there being impact from the roads. There's been no move to control erosion on these blasted hillsides or on these roads. I think these folks working on construction there have been extremely lucky that we had such a poor monsoon, because this is not going to stand up to monsoon rains, as anybody who's been outside during monsoon rains could attest. Again, I think the big impact will be road building. In areas this road is 15 foot to 30 or 40 foot wide. They're accommodating these massive, massive vehicles. Compaction is immense. And I think we'll see these roads serve as sites of introduction and spread of non-native species. Anywhere that I've seen wall construction, particularly historical wall construction, so the closer you get to Nogales, there's historical wall, there is there's this constant theme of weedy species, sometimes natives like desert broom and mesquite, which thrive in disturbance, but frequently non-native grasses like layman's love grass, buffalo grass, things like that. Here is just a great example of what this actually looks like in the field. This was one whole hillside, or a whole hill blasted through, the wall shoved down on the Mexico side of this blast. I am no homeland security expert, but to me, the road construction and the fact that they've blasted these remote areas that weren't areas where there was a lot of concentrated border crossing will in fact make it easier for individuals to cross during these areas. I mean, you don't actually have to climb this wall, you just have to go down it. And I think another big impact will be water usage. So this is just south of Kumero Mountain, and they have installed wells where they are pumping out the groundwater to feed these water trucks that all they do all day long is drive up and down these roads, spraying water in fans out the rear of the truck in order to keep dust down and compact the road. And again, you can see mesquite, love grass, and it's not visible in this beautiful and shocking photo by Luke Swinson, but there's also desert broom there. So again, these weedy species that I typically find associated with wall building projects. Time will tell what the long-term impacts of this will be, and whether the current administration will truly put a stop to it. And my hope and vision would be that perhaps the current or incoming administration would even consider remediating some of these areas. I kind of doubt it, because as soon as a president who's running on a pro-wall platform gets in, they'll just get right back to it. So it's hard to say if remediation efforts would be worth the investment, but it is really an interesting time to be doing botany along the borderlands as this construction is underway. Here again, just another couple of photos. I find this one particularly interesting. This isn't along the wall, but along an access road built to get to the wall. So again, these access roads will have great impact. You can see the roots of this desert spoon hanging exposed out of this blasted bedrock. You know, long term, I think plants along the edges will perhaps suffer, but again, there will be weedy species that will thrive. I think there's a perception that these border walls kill all life in the area. I think it's more complicated than that. I think their big impact is the change in species dynamics. So species that maybe weren't present or weren't abundant before become present after construction. And I'd like to just close up the depressing part of this talk. Maybe I should have done this part first by talking about a few of the common non-natives. Probably about half of the introduced species in the highlands are grasses. So Bermuda grass is a really, really common one around stock ponds and low wet spots that have been heavily grazed. As anyone who's ever had Bermuda grass in their yard can tell you, it is highly, highly competitive. Here we can see Malinus repens, Natal grass. This is one that seems to really like these open, hot hillsides. So as you get to the southern end of the range, you start to get more desert scrub species, saguaros and the like. And this plant forms these incredibly dense monocultures on these exposed hillsides. Where I see big patches of Malinus, I really do not see almost any native grasses. And I think increasingly through this drought period, we're going to see more and more. And buffalo grass, which is of course of great concern to folks here in Tucson, is only an issue in the lower, hotter areas of the range, particularly around Kumero Mountain, where this photo was taken. And we have to ask why these plants are here. Well, they were introduced because of the last, one of the last threats we talked about, which was cattle grazing. There was extreme stocking. We're talking like 1.5 million or more cattle in Arizona in the early 1890s. There was an extreme drought between 1891 and 93 that led to die-off of perhaps 50 to 75% of all cattle and extreme degradation of the range. So in the 30s, the Soil Conservation Service intentionally introduced many of these grass species. They're largely from South Africa, and I think one of their big advantages is an earlier flowering time than most of the natives, which gives them a competitive reproductive advantage over native grass species. And this drought may lead to a vast increase in acreage that's covered in non-native grass species versus a diverse array of some of the beautiful natives we have here in southern Arizona. That's about it for me. I think this is my final photo. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I haven't looked at the clock, so I'm not sure how long I talked for. Hopefully I kept it interesting. This is a photo again by Luke Swenson looking east towards Atascosa Peak. Here's Atascosa Lookout. As far as this project goes, I'm about 3 years into this flora. It will take me a while yet to complete collections. I'm working with photographer Luke Swenson on more of a land use history, social ecology of the region. Our project is tentatively called An Annotated Flora of the Atascosa Highlands. And it will cover history, interviews, historical photos, and a number of other subjects. We are getting there on publishing a website. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to provide info for accessing that website when it comes out, and for any people that are interested in learning more. Thank you all so much, and I'd like to turn it over for questions.
Thank you, Jack. That was just amazing, and beautiful pictures too.
Thank you.
And there are several questions here, but let me see here just a sec. Early in the chat, when you were talking about a yucca that has been, I guess, used in parking lots around Tucson, and someone called it a metro yucca. So I guess it was, I'm sorry, it says, wow,
Yeah, that acacia.
Farnesiana.
That acacia is a really,
Yeah.
really common urban landscaping tree. And, you know, again, I've seen it on roadsides. It's on Ruby Road. It's on other roadsides in southern Arizona. It was mind-blowing to see it in habitat. Again, the next comment there about fruits. I haven't seen it in flower or fruit. I'm hoping to catch it in flower this spring. I will say, typically you see lots and lots of pods around the bases of sweet acacias. I looked extensively crawling on my hands and knees under very thorny sweet acacias and couldn't find a single pod. So that would indicate that either they aren't, maybe didn't reproduce this year, or again, perhaps cattle are getting in there, though I've never seen cattle in that particular canyon, but I certainly wouldn't exclude them. They get into all sorts of places.
So Susie, the comment, and Jack, the comment about Metro Yucca from Perry,
Different, huh?
response to the yucca that you said that you thought might be a hybrid or that had very lax leaves.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty remote area, Sycamore Canyon. So, you know, I don't think it's a species that necessarily escaped from urban cultivation, but definitely, you know, there are a number of these hybrid yuccas around. Again, the Wendy Hodgson, who's just a fantastic, fantastic botanist. I think she even covered this a bit in her talk for the State Plant Society, which is on the State Plant Society YouTube. So if you want to learn more about these hybrid yuccas, it'd be worth checking out Wendy Hodgson's talk for the Botany Symposium.
And then also, what kinds of interesting cactus have you found in your field work? And I think that came early in the talk, so I think you covered some of those.
Well, I will say there's that Coryphantha recurvata, which is just a really great, very uncommon cactus. There's also the Bisbee beehive, Escobaria vivipara variety Bisbeeana. It's a very diminutive cactus. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the fishhook pincushion, Mammillaria grammii. It looks somewhat like that from a distance, but as you get close, it's more densely spined, lighter colored spines as well. So that's another really interesting cacti that I've seen out there, is that Bisbee beehive.
And has there been widespread fire in the area in historic times?
So great question. If we're looking at this last slide I have up here, you can see Atascosa Peak sort of to the left, and Atascosa Lookout is this big flat mesa attached to it. And there's a fire lookout there that is now just a foundation because in 2011 it burned down. Many of you are familiar with Edward Abbey, the sort of curmudgeonly but lovable nature writer. He actually spent some time manning that fire station. Now, semi-desert grassland habitats are very fire prone. Historically, they probably went through very frequent bouts of burning, perhaps as a result of lightning, drought, perhaps man influence, anthropogenically influenced fires started by indigenous folks for various reasons. So certainly, I believe this area evolved with a fire regimen, and the presence of a fire lookout would indicate that that was certainly the case historically. As is the case all across the Sky Islands, intensive grazing, mining. Ruby used to have about 1,300 people living there, so you could say urbanization. That induced people to really engage in fire suppression programs. That's also tied to the removal of indigenous groups from this landscape. That's one of the factors that is likely contributing to the buildup of woody shrubs on what was historically more or less pure grassland. So yes, there was historical fires. There was a big fire in 2011 that burned a lot of the pine habitat on top of Atascosa Lookout, as well as the lookout itself. And 2 years ago, there was a fire in Hell's Gate Canyon. That was not that big, about 700 acres. I do wonder with this drought if there won't be more of that coming along pretty soon. There's not a ton of woodland to burn, but certainly plenty of grassland that could go up. But there may be some benefit to that. But when paired with climate change, these fires can really irrevocably change the landscape. And as any of us that have watched the progress of the Bighorn fire know, could potentially influence invasive species coming into this area.
And then were there some things that, or what are some things that you might expect and would love to find but haven't found yet? Are there things you were looking for that you didn't find?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much in the middle of this process. So there are a number of things that have been historically collected that I haven't yet collected myself. A big one for me was that Psilotum nudum, the naked whisk fern, which I looked for over and over and over again, walked right by the spot, and it took someone else with a fresh pair of eyes seeing it for me to finally know where it's located. I'm sure there are, and another one is one that I've seen but haven't actually seen in bloom. That's Dahlia Tentaculoides, which is a beautiful dahlia species. I know exactly where it is, but I've never found it in bloom, which is awfully disappointing. Hopefully I could catch it in flower, because that would just make for decent photographs. If I had decent photographs, we would have seen it tonight, I'm sure.
Ah. And do you enlist volunteers for your project?
I not really. Again, I work with closely with Luke Swinson on this project. I would love, one of my great goals would be perhaps through the Native Plant Society to organize like bio blitzes or botany field trips out there. Places like Sycamore Canyon, Ruby, Atascosa Lookout, Kumero, Rock Corral, would love to do that. Obviously, the big limiting factor has been COVID. So as soon as that is not a mitigating factor, then I would be very happy to, I would love to have more people out there. Sometimes a fresh set of eyes is all you need to see a new plant and get a new collection that could be really valuable for the project.
So yeah, and actually that was something that was asked too, if you could lead a native plant field trip someday in the future.
Someday, when we get rain and when we can't all potentially damage each other's respiratory systems by proximity, I would love to. I maybe disparaged Ruby there, but it's actually a really beautiful little place to camp and some cool plants around there. So that would be a fun place to lead a trip someday.
Yeah, several years ago there was a native plant camp out there. And
yeah,
that was really interesting. And part of the attraction was to see the cicada killers, or those wasps, the wasps that
oh yeah,
prey on cicadas.
Yeah, Ruby is noted, and there's been extensive study about the cicada killers there at Ruby, and they actually really love that sand. It creates nice burrowing habitat for them, so that would be a cool one to see. We did actually have a trip to Sycamore Canyon planned for March, but for obvious reasons, just didn't pan out this year, but we'll get out there. And so keep an eye out for field trips when those become a possibility again.
So I think that pretty well, and then there are quite a few messages also of what a great presentation it was.
Glad you enjoyed it.
For you, Jack.
Well, thank you all for attending. It's I can always spend an evening talking about the Atascosas. It's literally my favorite place on the planet. So if anybody has any interest, maybe Lynn, I would be comfortable with you sharing my email if people email the Plant Society looking for more information.
Sure, that sounds great.
All right.
Thanks so much, Jack. Thanks, Susie, for fielding the questions. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we have a talk again in February 11th, and we hope you'll join us for that. I also wanted to just make the point, and we've lost some of our people, but I just wanted to let you know that if you're not on the listserv, you can get on the listserv to get automatic meeting notices. If you joined the society this year, you don't automatically get put on the listserv. We make it an opt-in rather than an opt-out kind of situation. So if you're a member of the Native Plant Society and you want to get the Tucson messages, you need to write to nativeplantstucson@gmail. And if you go to the Tucson webpage on the state webpage, the Tucson chapter page, you can find that address listed. And so please let me know if you want to be on the permanent mailing list. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next month.
If I could, I see there's one more question that I just want to respond to. It's to do with what rancher has the lease on the Ruby area, and if maybe there could be like a grazing rehabilitation. It's actually private land. It's one of the only places out there that's private. It's owned by some really fantastic people, the Fredericks, who have been very generous in letting me utilize that space. So it's actually grazing excluded because cattle tend to rub up against the buildings and destroy them. But I know their current caretaker is a former rancher, so perhaps they'll think about working some sort of remediation out. It's kind of a conflicting interest because part of the point of Ruby is keeping it as is, because it's one of the best preserved ghost towns in Arizona. So as far as remediation of that mine, I'm not sure if there's any plans. All right. Have a great night, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thanks for everything. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Jack.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Jack, check the chat before you sign off, and you can see all the people who told you that it was a great presentation. So
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, and also a few comments